here the potentially final draft of Neo Wonderland, and this is also the version that I'm going to be drawing. So, where do we start? First off, I'll start by saying that the writing process, whether it be screenplays, novels, comic book writing, it is all quite personal, like the way that we get started. And then I think from that point on, it's more about just a formatting thing. And whereas screenplays, generally speaking, it's more strict with the formatting, because you have to have studios, agents, editors read it. So there's a format, and because they go through so many, and there's so many pages, it's quite long compared to a comic book. So it's formatted a certain way. And with comic books, there's a general format, but it's not as strict, I guess you could say. The main difference is the way that the panel breakdowns happen with each page, because either the artist, or if you're an artist writer, you'd be the one to draw it. But it might be easy to say, well, you don't have to write full scripts, but at the same time, let's just say you wrote the script, like me, a year ago, or you started it a year ago. You go back, and then all of a sudden, if you didn't write a complete description or panel breakdown, you end up with a script where you kind of have to go back in and you start changing things or trying to recall things. And that frustration might lead to either walking away from the script, or, I mean, it might even lead to something great, but there's a lot left to chance when that happens. And I'm saying this from experience, because I've definitely done that. Because I started writing this script, I mean, technically a year ago, 6 months ago, but the story I've had around for 20 years. And it's changed quite a bit. They're the same structure for the story, still pretty much the same, but I definitely changed quite a bit of stuff, and I'll go over that. But for the time being, this is just a structure. And I mean, if you think about it, even a screenplay, it's not necessarily what's going to be shot or it's going to get used, but it's definitely a template. And I would say that comic book scripts are basically the same thing, because if you have a team that you're working with, it's going to be different if the artist sees a different approach to maybe a certain scene playing out, or a panel being drawn a certain way. It all depends on the relationship between the writer and the artist. So let's backtrack a little bit. I would just like to say that this is my process, and because there's not a set way of writing comic books per se, the process is quite different from person to person. And I think that's what's important to realize, is it's a very personal process. And we could go online and look for, how do you finish a script, or how do you start a script, where do you begin? And there's a lot of formatting and a lot of strategies and techniques that someone could basically give you for how to write something. However, it also comes down to your personality, the way that you work best. And I wouldn't say that, but there's a caveat. There's one thing you probably shouldn't do if you plan on becoming a professional writer, and that is to say, well, I'm not inspired right now, I don't feel like writing or drawing in my case. You could have a few of those days, but if you end up with too many of those days, eventually you fall behind, and it becomes a little too overwhelming and very hard to get back on that track. So I think that's the one thing that you have to have, is consistency. And how you get to that consistency with your style in mind, I think, is what I would like to talk about from my own experience. And so this is my way of writing comic book scripts, and how I learned, and how I become productive or finish a script. So that's one thing I'll keep in mind. And so without further ado, long intro and everything. Let's get started. So the first thing I do is obviously you come up with an idea, and I generally let an idea ruminate for a while, and kind of think about like why do I feel like this needs to be turned into a story that gets drawn and written. It has to resonate with me, like the common, maybe a theme, or I guess you could say the messaging, or what's the overarching reason for creating this story, and why does the world, if you're going to put it out there, why does the world need to hear this story? And of course, as an artist, I'll generally draw a character I think is kind of cool first, and kind of develop a story around it. But then, and come to think about it, that's how I start. And I know that writers are a little different. It may be a situation that they found themselves in, or something they heard or saw, or got inspired by another piece of art, and then they kind of develop that idea from there. But I feel like whether you start with a theme or a character, it kind of branches off from there. And so let's just say we're past that phase and we want to develop this idea. So the why you want to tell the story is important, and I know it should be the same category, but it's the how badly do you want to tell the story, because there's going to be, more often than not, times when you're going to have rough patches where you have a big huge spot in your story or plot hole, and you have to stare at it. And if you don't have an overarching theme or something that draws you to your characters or your story, it's going to fall apart and you're not going to finish it. So that's the one thing that I think is important. So you have to really want to tell that story like bad enough. And once you get past that, which is what I had to do, I could say that this story is what kind of started me on my path to really doing my own thing with comic books. Because early on, I don't know if I mentioned this, but I wasn't sure if anybody would hire me. When I first started out, I was still in college, to draw comic books. And, I needed more experience. So, of course, I came up with my own story so that I could draw something from. And, and I loved Top Cow and Witchblade especially, and then Fathom. So, I started drawing those characters, but then I had this story on my mind as well. And this is when Image was still fairly, I wouldn't say fairly new, but it's been a few years already, So I thought maybe I could pitch it to them. But obviously I started to develop this story a long time ago, it was like 20 years ago. And I was working on Lola for a while, and that kind of got me my feet wet, and then taught me how to write and draw my own stories. And so that's how that started. And with the amount of experience I've had now with the Lola scripts, and then reading scripts that I've had to draw, I felt like it was the right time for me to kind of tackle this head on, and then take it as far as I could take it now. So after I finished Lola, I was excited to work on this story. And that's kind of how I ruminated and started thinking about it. So what I did, the first thing I did was I took whatever ideas I remembered about the story, and usually it was like an emotional connection I had, and then I would write it down, like outline form, all the things that I remember, plot points that emotionally it like tore at my heartstrings, or made me laugh. And I wrote those down, and I tried to see if there's a way I could connect it, and if those plot points or those things that I remembered were important enough to be the main part of the story, or just a subplot, or just a little scene. And I think that's how it works for me. It's like I have to figure out where to categorize certain scenes and certain emotional aspects of my stories. And once I've figured out where they go, I developed a story around obviously the main plot and the things that are actually the most important. And when you're writing a story or coming up with an idea, generally something will stick out to you that makes you write around those events. And so that's kind of how I did this. And then I had the characters already sort of in place, but then I changed their personalities a little bit based off of experience and, just what spoke to me now, because I'm much older. You get a lot of experiences, and you change the way you view life quite a bit. And honestly speaking, truth be told, less judgmental about situations that people find themselves in. And I take a more empathetic or an approach where I try to understand why a character or a person does something, and I don't put a stamp on, oh, this person's just a bad person and they're doing it because they're bad. Because we know that nobody wants to believe that they're really bad, or it's very few people. I mean, we don't have to get into the psychology of that, but I take it from a neutral standpoint. You could even take two characters that would usually be main characters in a story, like the protagonist, and then pit them against each other. And depending on how you tell the story, one person is always going to come across as the bad guy. So that's kind of my approach to writing these characters. So let's backtrack. So once I come up with like a basic outline for the premise of the story, which you could, it's an outline for the whole entire, I would say at least first volume. So we're talking 6 issues, and then I'll have like a paragraph or two about what I'd like to have happen following the first volume, so I know where I'm headed. I mean, the more you know, of course, the easier it's going to be. And after that, I go in and break down like things that I know for sure I want to have happen 2 volumes, 3 volumes from now. I write that down. Like I used to not do that, or I'd have it on a piece of paper. Now I basically type it out. If I can't type it out, I write it down, come back to it. And so the outline, I think, to me is one of the most important aspects of starting a script, because once you've outlined, writing a full script is much easier because you've already figured out who your characters are, what their motives are, how you break down your act, first, second, third, sometimes fourth act, and then kind of go from there. So once I've written an outline, I break it down even more. Let's just say I've already written the outline for the first volume. Now, with all the important plot points plotted out, I go back to the first issue and I break down. And because you know that there's a page count, let's just say I know that I have to write 20 pages of script. I already know what the ending is going to be, and where the middle of the story has to be, like 10 pages in, what do I want to have happen, so that, you're not just reading a bunch of pages that go nowhere, because you got to sit there and draw all these pages, or someone else has to do it for you. And if you have an editor, before you even get it drawn, they have to read your script, and you want to make sure it's moving along. And mind you, it took me a lot of experience, and who knows, I'm still working on it. So it might not even be that good. Who knows? I'm going to do it anyways. But then after that, I break it down like that. And if there's an event that I feel like is a page turner, I'm all about that. This is a comic book, and so what's special about this format. I try to make sure that if there's a page turn, that it's on the right page, whether it's an odd page or an even page. It all depends, but I like page turners, and especially breaking down the story and the cliffhanger, where it should go. There should be something that happened from the beginning to the end of the comic that makes it the page turn, or somebody wants to buy the issue. It's a lot like a TV show, obviously, so you'd write it like a serialized series and less like a movie. So that's my approach to writing the script. And then the one thing that's going to stand out with comic books that you don't necessarily have with screenplays per se, or the way it's numbered, is the panel breakdowns. So let's just say I don't know how many panels I'm going to have on one page, but I have like the gist of how the pages is a lot like the Marvel way, how they do it. It's basically just a summary of what's happening on the page. I would at least put, this happens, that happens, and let's just say I know exactly what first panel is going to look like. Panel 1. I just skip around until I feel like the pages I know more of what's happening, and I already have a breakdown. Let's just say I want a splash page. Easy, that's going to say splash. If there's supposed to be 4 to 6 panels, I'll write 4 to 6 panels and then fill it in like that. And then the dialogue that I know for sure is going to be there and what I want to have set on that page. And that's kind of how the process works. It's once you have an outline, it makes it much easier, less intimidating, so you're less likely to have a panic attack when you go back and read your already fully written script. If you have to skip around. You know what works best. You fill in spots of your script so that you have this momentum, which I think is very important. With writing, we put so many stipulations, so many rules, so many things in front of us where to to start is almost impossible. And so I think if you're starting out, the one thing that I say is the most important thing is to take as much friction off of you starting as you can. Starting and then the desire to start again. For me, that would mean listening to music that would get me going. And I mean, everybody has like a soundtrack for the stories they're trying to tell. So it would be a soundtrack. And usually a lot of it is, there's no words if I'm writing. If I'm drawing, I'll listen to music that there's lyrics and stuff. But I usually start out with music that will get me going with no words, depending on what kind of script I'm writing or what scene. And then, especially if I came up with a certain idea and there was a certain emotion behind a song, I will play that song. So I really get into it like that. And I think the first 15 minutes of writing is the most important, because that's when your mind starts to focus and it kind of goes on autopilot. And that's why we get frustrated if someone interrupts us when you're writing or trying to think of something. So that's basically it. And it doesn't have to be perfect or articulate. Just write your thoughts down, because that process is the most important. And don't burn yourself out if you're not used to writing for long periods of time. Just do as much as you can. And, once you have a little momentum, you're going to want to do it again and again and again. And, honestly, I held off on writing for long periods of time because I'm like, okay, I need to carve out like 5 hours to do the script. And, 6 months goes by and you're like, that's never happening, because I have to draw for work full time and run my little business on the side. So writing was not something that I was able to get to and do 5 hours at a time. So I'm like, okay, you know what? I'm just going to throw half an hour in and get a few sentences down, a paragraph down, a page down. And before you know it, you have 32 pages of actual story to show for it. And I have this routine, and because I love the process so much, like with anything, if I love the process or I want to love the process and I want to get good at it, I usually make everything about it like special, So for me, with writing, I print out the scripts. Even if I have it on the computer, if I start drawing, I at least want to have it on paper. So when I'm reading through it, want to make notes or find something, it's just a different way of looking at things versus you typing on the computer and then reading it that way. I think this gives me a fresh set of eyes, on top of the fact that, generally, because I don't have a whole lot of time, I try to get back to the script as quickly as possible. So I print out my script. I'm sure there's problems with it still, but this is enough for me to feel comfortable to start drawing this comic book. So this means the world to me, and I feel like this is a symbol of my progress as a writer and an artist. So I'm happy to keep going with this, and excited to show you guys what I've learned. And hopefully this is a really quick look at my process, and of course I'm gonna do more of these, and I kind of grow hopefully along the way. So as always, thanks for stopping by, and I hope to see you guys around.